Mysterious drones over New Jersey?
The nationwide sightings of mysterious drones.
Weeks of mysterious drone sightings.
You're telling me we don't know what the hell these drones are in New Jersey are?
That's right.
They're saying no threat, but how the hell do they know? They don't know anything. They don't know what it is. They don't know where it come from.
Tip of the iceberg would be a gross understatement for that headline. More like tip of a sunken continent.
No, that ain't no plane, yo.
What the fuck is that, bro?
People in New York and New Jersey see drones the size of an SUV over their house every night and think that that doesn't make any sense.
Certainly I understand why people would be looking at this and being concerned about it. We're concerned about it too.
The U.S. Air Force says they're drones. Don't you fucking believe it. The U.S. Air Force lies.
There was a drone just hanging out. I put my drone up in the air and went towards it. Not 3 minutes into the flight, the drone started going down, dead.
These are fully charged batteries.
What's going on here isn't new, and these aren't all drones.
You see it? You see how it goes?
And they're not just over New Jersey. They're all over the world.
There were several mystery drone flights over our nuclear testing range.
Just take a look at all of the military sites all over the world that these drones have visited. This is the continuation of a story that's been unraveling since the dawn of the atomic age.
Based off of the information that you've been privy to, is there any indication that these UAPs are interested in our nuclear technology and capabilities?
Yes.
And by external observation, sure, that could be a fair assessment, yeah.
Yes.
After the detonation of the atomic bombs in Japan, that's when the UFO sightings ramped up.
When Oppenheimer detonated the world's first atom bomb at Trinity Test Site in 1945, and later as Edward Teller's hydrogen bomb shook the South Pacific in 1952. Since then, UFOs have been systematically surveying and even tampering with our nuclear weapons, stockpiles, and power plants.
All 10 missiles were off alert, all 10. Whole flight was off alert, all red.
And I said, it looks like we got a UFO.
UFOs consistently appear at nuclear weapons facilities and energy grids around the world. From Los Alamos to Hanford to Oak Ridge to Malmstrom to Minot to FE Warren to Savannah River Site to Royal Air Force bases in the UK and nuclear sites in the former Soviet Union, UFOs are seen hovering over silos, tampering with comms links, and even disabling nuclear missiles themselves.
They were not launchable. They were in a no-go condition.
And if you want to learn all about it, you're in luck, because today's amazing American alchemist is Robert Hastings, the man who has dedicated his life to documenting this unquestionable connection.
Jesse Michels and his crew are here today and they're doing an interview with me, so we're in the middle of that. So let me call you later today and we'll discuss this further.
His nearly 600-page book, UFOs and Nukes, is literally the world's best database on this phenomenon. I view your book, UFOs and Nukes, as sort of the best possible database when it comes to credible witnesses viewing UFOs. Hastings has personally interviewed 167 employees of nuclear bases across the United States, many of whom are cleared to the most sensitive American national security secrets.
Holy mackerel, there's this white pulsating object.
That can't be one of ours.
These are missile technicians, ICBM security personnel, missileers, radar operators, and more, who have all seen orbs, saucers, disks, and tic-tacs in and around the most sensitive nuclear airspace. By nature of who they are, these witnesses are inherently some of the most reliable in the world. Some literally have their finger on the nuclear button.
You know, they're on what they call PRP. They have to report if they're taking ibuprofen, for God's sakes.
And these witnesses couldn't care less about fame or attention. In fact, most of them want to avoid these things at all costs. In fact, many of them have suffered intensely in their careers for speaking out about their experiences.
A flag was being put in their folders, citing them as a security risk, so that if they sought employment with an aerospace company or something, the Air Force would have designated them to be security risks.
We will interview two of these witnesses with mind-blowing stories directly in this episode, and you can be the judge. One was threatened repeatedly, and his records were deleted from Vandenberg Air Force Base.
They threatened my life. You're going down, motherfucker, means to me, we're going to kill you. They denied there was ever a Robert Jacobs in the Air Force.
He gets a phone call one night. He and his wife come home from a movie. The phone rings. The voice says, "Your mailbox alight, what a beautiful sight, you're going down, motherfucker."
While the other boarded a craft at Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota.
They were just multi-levels with all these small grays everywhere.
Hastings has risked his life in telling stories like these. Do you feel like your communications are being tracked? Or
No question. After each one of those calls, I would talk to them, hang up the phone. Within a minute or 5 or 10, the phone would ring, I would pick it up, and there'd be nothing but heavy breathing in the phone.
I originally met Robert because I had been going around making constant public references to his great book, UFOs and Nukes.
Robert Hastings, who wrote UFOs and Nukes.
So Robert emailed me because he wanted to let me know that while he had documented 100+ UFO witnesses at nuclear sites across the US, I was personally overstating the amount of radar operators who he had spoken to. If that doesn't say something about Robert's character and attention to detail, I don't know what does. He comes from a bygone era of meticulousness and passion that journalists used to display, and one that's easily palpable in this interview.
Robert Hastings was 100% spot on before anybody else. And this is a man who deserves the recognition. He is the giant that a lot of us has stood on his shoulders.
It does not contain any pattern of purpose or of consistency.
This documentary will answer the two biggest critiques thrown at UFOs by skeptics. Number one, UFOs are ephemeral. They show up randomly and sporadically. There's nothing repeatable or predictable about them.
The nuclear thing is a repeatable pattern. Legacy UFO programs have used nuclear material or sometimes even phony nuclear material to bait UFOs to show up.
And number two, UFOs are some American deep state psyop. Why do they only seem to show up at American military bases?
A huge disc-shaped object was seen hovering over this missile base in Soviet Ukraine. The Bentwaters case in 1980 in England, that was the largest group of tactical nuclear weapons being stored in Western Europe.
And it went back out into the field, and then it exploded silently into objects, white objects, and disappeared.
UFOs are repeatably and scientifically attracted to nuclear sites.
You can kind of guess if there is a UFO sighting, there might be a nuclear connection there.
Take the most famous archetypal sighting in American history, the crashed flying disc at Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. Well, Roswell was actually the site of the first atomic bomber squadron in America, the squadron responsible for dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1994, 62 elementary school kids at the Ariel School in Zimbabwe said that they saw a silver craft descend from the sky and land on a field near the school. Well, guess where the Ariel School was?
And you know, an Ariel School that was near a uranium mining site.
That is right, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
And what about that story that Vice ran in 2022 about a little town in Japan that's obsessed with UFOs? It's a place called Ino, and it's actually right next to Fukushima's nuclear grid. And after an earthquake famously triggered a nuclear power meltdown there in 2011, the chief monk of a local temple said, "The UFOs came after the explosion. There were so many of them. I was shocked." Similarly, Harvard PhD Jensine Andreessen writes about UFO activity at the height of the Chernobyl disaster, when many people in the area observed a UFO come, stay for 3 minutes, shine a light at the reactor, and depart. I could go on all day. By the end of this documentary, the only question you'll be left with is why? Why are UFOs so interested in our nuclear technology?
It's no different than we go to the Serengeti and we watch the cheetahs preying upon the antelope. You know, it's interesting to watch. What are their hunting techniques? What are their capabilities?
I mean, it might be as simple as like it's an attractant, like a fly or a mosquito to a blue light, right?
It's kind of like taking matches out of the hands of a baby.
Whoa.
Yeah, whoa, right?
So without further ado, meet the man who has risked his life documenting this unquestionable but infinitely bizarre connection, a mysterious link that lies at the heart of the modern UFO question. This week's American alchemist, the legendary Robert Hastings. Did you know your personal information is being bought and sold online right now? Data brokers collect and sell your private details like your phone number, address, and even information about your relatives. This makes it easier than ever for scammers, stalkers, and even strangers to access your data. With the rise in online threats, protecting your privacy is no longer optional. I use Delete Me to take control of my online privacy. It's a hands-free subscription service that removes my personal information from hundreds of data broker sites. I recently got my privacy report, and seeing how many sites had my info and then watching that data disappear was absolutely incredible. Delete Me's experts do all the work for you, monitoring and removing your data all year round. It's not just about protecting yourself. When data brokers sell your information, they also expose details about your family. That's why Delete Me offers a family plan to help you safeguard your loved ones too. This episode is sponsored by Delete Me. Get 20% off by going to joindeleteme.com/Jesse20 and using the code Jesse20 at checkout. Protect your personal information and take back your privacy today.
Declassified U.S. government documents and witness testimony from former or retired U.S. military personnel confirmed beyond any doubt the reality of ongoing UFO incursions at nuclear weapons sites.
How does anybody get into the topic of UFOs showing up around nuclear sites?
My father was career Air Force, and in 1967 he was stationed at Malstrom Air Force Base, Montana. I was a junior in high school at the time. He got me a job at the air traffic control tower on the base as a janitor. At one point, I made the acquaintance of an FAA supervisor named Bob Grasser. One night, and as best as I can tell, it was the second half of March of '67, was emptying trash cans and pushing a broom. And he motioned me over to his scope. And he pointed, he said, we're tracking, and he probably said unknowns. That's the formal term for unidentified objects. I saw 5 blips in the sort of northeast quadrant of his radar scope. As I recall it after all these years, I got kind of excited by this and started peppering him with questions. And his whole demeanor kind of went, uh-oh, you know, I've said too much. Nevertheless, I went home and told my dad, you know, you're not going to believe what happened tonight at the tower. He said, the guys that I'm talking to down there think they're probably Soviet surveillance planes. And even though I was 16, I went, 5 surveillance planes, you know, and the controller told me they were basically stationary. You know, are the Soviets flying helicopters over Montana? I don't think so.
When his stint as a janitor at Malstrom was over, Robert went to college, got married, and began working as a photographer. But that gnawing urge to understand what he had witnessed never left him. In 1973, while brushing up on UFOs, he stumbled upon an article that famed astronomer J. Allen Hynek had written in 1966 while running Project Blue Book, the official government UFO investigations program out of the Air Force. The article said that UFOs had flown around nuclear missiles at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota.
And I went, holy crap, you know, that's had to be what was happening at Malmstrom. So I was off and running at that point, and slowly but surely during the early 70s onward, I just began seeking out military veterans who might have information they could share.
When we got down there, they told us that this bogey was out there right over the Hanford Ordnance Works and directed Lieutenant Commander Brown to take off and challenge him.
Thanks to Robert's efforts, we now know that UFO overflights of nuclear bases were happening as early as 1945 in the United States.
Months before the Trinity test in New Mexico, months before the atomic bombings in Japan, Bud Clem was describing luminous balls of light hovering over the Hanford plutonium production site, being chased away unsuccessfully by jet fighters on 3 occasions.
He said, all I can see is a bright red or reddish-orange fireball right up in front of me.
When the Roswell object crashed, which Lue Elizondo in his new book has said was indeed a bona fide UFO crash in July of 47, that base was the only nuclear bomber base in the world at the time.
In 1948, a renowned expert in meteorites at the University of New Mexico named Lincoln La Paz began studying green fireballs, often in correlation with nuclear facilities and detonations. He concluded that given the fireballs' flight patterns, that they were artificially controlled and not just naturally occurring phenomena.
Dan Wilson spent I don't know how many hours tracking down green fireball sightings that were coinciding with radiation drifting across the American landscape. Dozens and dozens of instances where within hours of a certain test occurring and the subsequent radiation drifting across this part of America or that part of America, those geographic locations had green fireball sightings.
Fascinating.
When they exploded, unlike a normal meteor, there was no noise, there was no debris found.
It didn't continue after 1948, so the question is still open.
And what about the famous DC flyover in 1952?
In Washington, ghost-like objects dart across the radar screen at the CAA Traffic Control Center at National Airport for several hours, traveling more than 100 miles an hour.
This was a very famous incident where saucers were seen everywhere in and around Washington, D.C., causing headlines like "Saucers on the White House Lawn," and an emergency phone call between President Truman and Blue Book chief investigator Edward J. Ruppelt. But what did any of this have to do with nuclear?
What happened in 1952?
The D.C. UFO sightings in July.
Yeah, I was going to say the...
Well, what else?
The first H-bomb.
The H-bomb. Tell her, yeah.
The concern that I have is that in 1952, what if there was someone there to hear what we said in the Pacific? We sent off a signal, just the way when North Korea detonates a nuclear device, it sends seismic waves through the earth. It can't stop sending information outside of the country. I think in 1952, we sent a signal to the cosmos, which is that we're very, very close to being in possession of root-level knowledge, to take a software metaphor. If there was something or someone there to hear us, they probably heard us as saying, we're on the verge of being able to come visit you. That's terrifying.
But the DC flyover occurred in July of 1952, and the first hydrogen bombs were tested later that year in November. So the timing is a bit off if Weinstein is attempting to draw an exact correlation. But what's not as well known is that at the time, a state-of-the-art plutonium and tritium production facility was being built at Savannah River Site in South Carolina. In July of 1952, it had just become operational, and it was the most secretive atomic site in the United States. In fact, a young nuclear engineer stationed there named John Anderson was required to attend a group event with 100 other engineers on site to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the founding of DuPont Company in 1802. Kinda weird, but hey, I guess that's what you celebrate while working on a nuclear site. Anderson and his colleagues were quickly overtaken by a green glowing object, angular in size, darting back and forth erratically at high speeds and altitudes, with phenomenal maneuverability. We now know that the date of this event was likely July 19, 1952, the peak day of sightings for the 1952 DC flyover. Were the UFOs perhaps trying to send a message to our federal government? And what was being detected by the best American telescopes at the time? Well, I've spoken to an amazing Swedish astronomer named Beatriz Villarroel about just that.
So we were comparing these images from the early 50s
to images as it looks today, and I was hoping to see this perfect sparkling star that you can find in multiple images that one day vanishes. And I had this image where you could see multiple stars appearing and vanishing, which is completely crazy. I got an idea of that one of the ways how one can also search for more such examples by looking for those that are lying along a line or in a narrow band. And we had 2 such examples that were statistically significant. One is 5 objects on a narrow band, and it's from the 27th of July 1952. And then my colleague Enrique found these 3 stars that triple transient. This one is from the 19th of July 1952.
That's absolutely amazing. I mean, because in UFO lore, this Washington invasion or DC flyover where there were saucers all over DC at the time, and it was July of 1952, but it was specifically 2 weekends. It was the 19th and 20th, and it was the 26th and 27th. So I find that absolutely remarkable.
But Eric Weinstein may have still been right in another sense. There is actually a direct link between the hydrogen bomb blasts at the Marshall Islands and UFOs. The famous tests codenamed Operation Ivy and Operation Castle.
There was another major one called Project Castle or Operation Castle in the spring of '54. And I found sailors who were aboard various vessels who were describing very brief but clearly sightings of disc-shaped objects or spherical-shaped objects hovering over their ships.
In fact, the entry from the deck log of the USS Curtis, the ship that detonated the hydrogen bomb at Bikini Atoll, reads, "At 23:05, an unidentified luminous object passed over ship from bow to stern, yellowish-orange in color, traveling at a high rate of speed in a low altitude."
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
The connection between UFOs and nuclear was known since the beginning of American government atomic programs. We now know, due to verified declassified documents, that on May 5, 1949, after multiple sightings at Killeen Base at Camp Hood, Texas, which stored America's largest nuclear stockpile to date, that an emergency meeting was held. The meeting included the Air Force's Office of Special Investigations, the Office of Naval Intelligence, Army Counterintelligence, and the FBI. They were called in to discuss the sudden, ubiquitous appearance of UFOs across nuclear bases in the US. Also that year, a now public FBI memo was sent to Director J. Edgar Hoover, reporting flying discs, flying saucers, and balls of fire, quote-unquote, considered top secret by intelligence officers of both the Army and Air Force. The memo goes on to discuss frequent sightings at Los Alamos, the headquarters of the Manhattan Project.
There's some people I'm colleagues with that, like, their grandparents were actually, the UFO report people on the Manhattan Project. And I remember being told that. I'm like, really? Holy crap, that's crazy. There's like a whole other side of the Manhattan Project.
The connection between UFOs and nuclear was known since the beginning of American government atomic programs. And UFOs are classified with the same protocols governing American atomic secrets.
If something is not a nuke, but it has radiological energy coming off it, alpha, beta decay, whatever.
Same secrecy.
Same secrecy.
In a 1952 Look magazine article titled "The Hunt for the Flying Saucer," Chief UFO Investigator for the Air Force, Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, is quoted saying, "Many of the sightings reported had originated at one atomic weapons-related site or another, all around the country."
And Ruppelt is on record in the article saying that we are aware of 63 separate incidents of UFOs being sighted at nuclear weapons facilities.
In fact, the rumors of UFOs at Los Alamos and other nuclear sites were so widespread that Eleanor Roosevelt wrote to Oppenheimer inquiring about them. Responding with a letter that's been fully verified and archived in the Library of Congress, Oppenheimer wrote back reassuring the former First Lady that these were just rumors. But from a 1971 Australian intelligence document written by the head of their nuclear division, Harry Turner, Oppenheimer was deeply involved in exotic anti-gravity research. So was Oppenheimer playing dumb?
Would Oppenheimer have been told? The Manhattan Project would have custody of it, and then it would go into the Atomic Energy Commission, and then it would go into the Department of Energy, which has its own line of clearances. And that's why I can't find, among the people I know who have clearances above top secret, they've never heard of this.
Yeah.
They've never heard of this because you can be in the Pentagon with a top secret clearance, but if you're not briefed on the atomic secrets, you wouldn't get the clearances that you needed to do to open up that thing.
Fast forward to 1964. We're on Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. A classified program is taking place called Atlas, testing dummy nuclear warheads being launched from intercontinental ballistic missiles. A photo instrumentation specialist, Lieutenant Bob Jacobs, was tasked with capturing the launch of 2 missiles from 100 miles north of Vandenberg at Big Sur.
A giant 18-wheel truck came trucking up this Forest Service road and brought this enormous catadioptric telescope with a focal length of about 2,000 inches. The normal length on a 35mm camera is 2 inches, so you can imagine how big the image would be in a 2,000-inch lens. So I said, wow, this is neat. And the guy who had built this thing was named Walt Manning, Dr. Walt Manning at Boston University. At any rate, we got the telescope all set up, and we were ready to go, and Major Mansman called, and he said, tomorrow morning at 0600, get ready because we're launching an Atlas missile, and we want you to photograph that with the big BU telescope. I went, okay. So at 0600, we were up and ready to go, and an Atlas missile popped up through the ground fog that was covering the whole coastline all the way down there. It was beautiful. We took the film back to Vandenberg, where it was processed, and a day later, I got a call from Major Mansman. He said, come up to my office. So I went to his office, and he said there was a movie screen set up and a 16mm projector, and there was Major Mansman, and as I recall, 2 guys in gray suits. On the screen was the film we had shot. We could see clearly on film the nose cones separate, and then we saw the dummy warhead. And suddenly, into that frame, an object flew in, chasing the warhead and so on at the same speed. It's going between 6,000 and 8,000 miles an hour at that point. And it fired a beam of light at the dummy warhead. The object flew up like this, shot another beam of light at the dummy warhead, went around like this, shot another beam of light at it, went down like this, shot a beam of light like this, and then flew out the same way it had come in. At which time, the dummy warhead did this and fell out of the frame.
Florence Mansman analyzed the film frame by frame with a magnifier, what's called a loop magnifier. And he's on record by the mid-'80s, he was writing to Jacobs in private letters saying, what I saw with the magnifier was a disc-shaped object with a dome. And before each of the 4 flashes of light were observed, the whole disc pivoted, flashed the light, pivoted back, and then pivoted again for the next flash.
The lights came on, and Major Mansman said to me, were you guys screwing around up there? And I said, no, sir. And he said, what was that? And I said, it looks like we got a UFO. And he said, Lieutenant Jacobs, you are never to speak of this again. It never happened. The 2 guys in the gray suits stood behind him looking at me. He said, do I make myself clear? I said, yes, sir. What else are you going to say to the major in charge of you?
So who were these mysterious men in suits?
Mansman said they were CIA, and they confiscated the film, not a higher Air Force office. CIA confiscated the film.
Didn't they delete your records from the government as well? People denied that you worked at Vandenberg. Is that right?
They denied there was ever a Robert Jacobs in the Air Force. And in another inquiry, they denied there was ever a Robert Jacobs at Vandenberg Air Force Base. Then they denied there was ever anybody named Robert Jacobs in charge of the 1369th Photographic Union division that I ran.
And you managed over 100 people, so it's pretty easy for you to corroborate.
Yeah, I had 134 guys working for me, and I had two friends from college who were my commanding people. And I also have something called a DD-14. I have records here. My officer efficiency reports are in there. I can't get rid of stuff. My wife keeps saying, "Clear that shit out of the file cabinet over there, Bob." I go, "No, I might use it." And sure enough, it's turned out to be valuable in defending myself against the infamy of the CIA. But we didn't have a launch on that date. There was no Atlas launch that day. Well, goddamn well there was, because Robert found the files from Vandenberg using that particular launch in detail.
So they also scrubbed the launch itself from the records.
Correct. Never happened.
Wow. And your mailbox was blown up as well, right?
My wife and I had been out to a movie. We came back from a movie about 10 o'clock at night, and there was a message on my answering machine. And it said, "Fireworks in your mailbox at night. Oh, what a beautiful sight. You're going down, motherfucker." And my mailbox blew up. I live on a farm. I had a rural mailbox, and so there was an explosion. My mailbox blew up. I took that quite seriously. I bought an ammunition for my gun.
Well, we now basically know that in 1952, the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence took the real UFO investigations underground. They did this while performing a psychological operation on the American population in the form of Air Force's Project Blue Book, which was explicitly meant to downplay and explain away UFOs.
Project Blue Book was the best they could do at the time because they felt they had a real project going on that was secret. Okay.
Is that true?
And the Air Force did.
Oh, I didn't know that. So really, it was the CIA and the Atomic Energy Commission responsible for the real, deeper research on UFOs. The FBI and the Air Force's Project Blue Book were kept in the dark. This clip from the great James Fox movie Out of the Blue is perhaps telling.
Edgar Hoover wrote several letters stating that the investigation of unidentified flying objects is not and never has been within the jurisdiction of the FBI.
Here's just another example of joint CIA atomic energy research going on around UFOs at the time. At the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, on the 25th of October in 1962, a nuclear test called Bluegill Triple Prime was executed. It involved a sub-megaton X-1 nuclear warhead launched minutes before midnight at Johnston Atoll in the South Pacific. According to many on the ship witnessing the test, a bright, fiery object tumbled out from the plume of the blast. There is apparently video evidence of this. In fact, an Australian intelligence officer who's dealt with sensitive nuclear assets named Jeff Cruikshank says that this video was later sanitized and censored to cover up the UFO. He says that a white triangle was later superimposed on the video where the object tumbles out of the plume.
Only a few milliseconds after the detonation, the fireball is approximately a kilometre wide. A bright, fiery object tumbles out from within the nuclear fireball. And it's plain as day. You can slow it down and see this very bright object. It must be at least 50 to 100 metres long, tumble out from within the nuclear fireball.
You believe that that is some kind of craft?
Just like the one that was following the Atlas 8F test, but this time it was a real warhead.
Cruikshank also maintains that the recovery effort was documented in the original ship's deck logs, and that a spherical debris with some very interesting properties was found. These tests were overseen by the Albuquerque Operations Office, whose Atomic Energy Commission director was none other than Lawrence Guys, who happens to be Jeff Bezos' maternal grandfather.
Is it everything you thought it would be?
But Jeff Cruikshank is just one source, and he's in Australia. Harold Malmgren, a direct advisor to 4 American presidents, including JFK, is a man whose credentials are beyond reproach. And just look at what he tweeted. Am now reconstructing my personal interactions with Los Alamos, Lawrence Guys, Bluegill ICBM interception tests, 1961-62, and JFK visit to Los Alamos, November 1962. So it sounds like JFK might have gotten into UFOs in November of 1962. All of this might explain this letter of admittedly controversial provenance that was supposedly FOIA'd in 2005. It's from JFK, but it's dated November 12, 1963, just 10 days before his death. In the letter, the president is asking the CIA director, John McCone, for all data on unknowns so the Americans could coordinate better with the Soviets on détente, and so the Soviets wouldn't mistake UFOs for acts of American aggression. All of this would also explain some very interesting recent statements made by Trump's FBI appointee, Kash Patel, about the JFK file.
You're talking to a guy that's read the entire JFK file. The things that we can't release have nothing to do with the questions you guys are asking. The answers you guys want pretty much have them. There's very minimal stuff that can't be seen for things that you wouldn't even think are related to.
I want to be clear. We don't have enough clarity on the origins of this letter to know that it's conclusively real. It was supposedly FOIA'd by a guy in 2005, so I don't know if it's real, but it fully comports with Malmgren's story that JFK visited Los Alamos in '62. It also makes sense in the context of JFK's détente efforts with Russia. John Greenwald has done some good work investigating this document and has found some anomalies in it. If any other researchers can either prove it to be a forgery or real, that would be extremely helpful and revelatory. So have at it. But I digress. Let's move away from speculation and get back to the abundance of overwhelming hard facts around the widespread UFO nuclear link.
Do you have conviction that the video that you watched was not altered in any way? And what is the source of that conviction, if you do?
Do you know Lue Elizondo?
I do, yeah.
He verified. When he was in charge of ATIP, he saw my film, my account. It's been transferred to DVD at that point, but he saw it and he said that's exactly what I saw.
We saw the video, and we had it on ATIP.
That's crazy, because that's what I was going to ask you. He said, he was like, I think Lue has seen the video. So you've seen the video.
Yeah.
So you know this is a real thing.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Is the video, do you still have the video, or?
I don't have it. Was in Pentagon with all my other files when the Pentagon said they deleted everything. Of course, we know they really didn't, because
really
after they, oh yeah.
Oh my God.
I know where everything is. And then when I talked to a buddy of mine, apparently somebody went in and they cleaned everything out. But what they don't realize is that there's backups in a whole lot of places at that Pentagon.
Oh, okay.
So the problem is, if I say it right now, they'll go and mysteriously a bunch of people's computers will wind up disappearing tomorrow. So I'm just going to wait until the right time. And, that stuff is alive and well.
I just wanted to put enough out there, touch on all the most sensitive parts, but I don't want to overly disclose because it's not my job.
Someone told me that Dave Grush was aware of the film. And when he was on the task force, he had a colleague check a military archive to see if they could find any confirmation of the Big Sur incident. According to Dave, this person did indeed find radar data confirming that an anomalous aerial object paced the warhead. I think that's about all I can say publicly at this point.
There is evidence that someone, or more accurately something, has tampered with our nuclear capability.
Bob Jacobs' incident at Big Sur was just one example of a UFO directly interfering with military technology. Just a few years later, hundreds of miles away at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, another unsettling event would take place, this time affecting an entire row of intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Salas. In 1967, I was a first lieutenant stationed at Malstrom Air Force Base, Montana. Sometime in the evening hours on March 24th, I received a call from one of my topside guards, the flight security controller, stating that they had been observing strange lights in the sky making odd maneuvers. He called back about 5 minutes later. This time he was screaming into the phone saying they're looking at an object, a red glowing object hovering just above our front gate. I went to wake my commander, Fred Mywald, who was taking a rest break, started to tell him about the phone call, and just as I told him, our missiles began going into what's called a no-go condition or unlaunchable. Essentially, they were disabled. The missiles started shutting down or going off alert. The only thing I could think was, oh my God.
Bob Jameson, you were there too, right?
Yes, sir.
And you were in the Air Force?
Yes, I was in the Air Force.
And where were you when this was happening?
Okay, was a targeting officer, missile targeting officer. I was at home relaxing, and I got a call from Job Control to tell them to come in.
And sure enough, on Job Control, they have a wall, and they have green lights where all the missiles are on alert. Except for one corner, all 10 missiles were off alert, all 10. The whole flight was off alert, all red.
Is it possible they just malfunctioned?
That doesn't happen. Very rarely does a missile malfunction, and I don't think much more rare would be 2 at the same time, but never 10.
And they told me, yes, it was a sheriff in Roy, Montana, reported a UFO at the same time all the missiles went off alert. The same person that told me that all 10 missiles went off alert also told me that there was a UFO that went down into a canyon near a little town not far from Malmstrom called Belt, Montana. There was a canyon there, and there was a UFO trapped in the canyon. The canyon's too steep to send men down in the night. This is at nighttime. The walls are too steep to send men down at night, or even a helicopter down through that. So they're going to take, in them, as soon as daylight comes, they're going to take some helicopters and go down in there. And I found out later, as soon as daylight came, they sent the helicopters, and this UFO just went right through the helicopters and out. Between the helicopters and out.
Skeptics have said that what you experienced and what Bob Salas have reported really amounted to some sort of Air Force drill, readiness drill. How would you respond to that?
Okay, I've heard of that, but I tell you right now, the Pentagon, the military will not shut down 10 strategic missiles just to hold a friggin' test. It's not worth it. Or if we hold down, we had 1,000 missiles at the time. If you take 10 down, you destroy a little bit of our national security. And the Pentagon, the Air Force, SAC would not do that. And they never have done it.
I've already mentioned my awareness of a radar tracking at Malmstrom in the spring of '67. Based on my knowledge of the time frame when I was at the tower, and the events that I witnessed on the radar screen where I was shown these 5 objects, the time of day that occurred in the evening, it's conceivable that I witnessed what Bob was dealing with out at the missile site.
Who makes the encryption for these sort of systems? Is that the NSA? Is that the
It's an Air Force system, so I'm assuming that all the coding and all the technical aspects are controlled by the Air Force.
Okay.
Boeing is the main missile contractor. I know, in fact, there's a guy named Arnie Arneson who is a former Air Force officer, and he, in the course of giving this testimony publicly, has said one of his jobs was to take the encrypted missile launch codes to the various missile sites.
Wow.
So it's an Air Force operation.
Wow.
Yeah.
Malmstrom, like many of the sites mentioned here, have experienced repeated UFO encounters. In fact, in January of 1993, combat targeting team member John Mills recalls driving with a 6-person crew back to Malstrom Base where he was stationed and seeing a bright object zigzagging around the sky. When the crew got back to command, everybody at the Vehicle Equipment Control Branch was saying that there had been anomalies all over the base that day. It was an open secret that the site was covered in UFOs. We now go to Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota in 1966.
707 understood, give me a couple seconds.
Historically, these UFOs seem to toy with American nuclear sites, turning them off at will. But in this specific case, an especially jarring one, nuclear missiles were actually activated. Retired U.S. Air Force Captain David Schindel remembers starting his shift and hearing reports about a bright red glowing object hovering over the base.
When I came through the door, I was met by the site manager, a tech sergeant, and he put his hands out like this, and he says, that object out there had flashing lights. He sort of indicated how big that object was by putting his hands out like that. And I estimated maybe it was 80, 100 feet wide, I don't know, and probably about 100 feet away from the facility.
The objects flew over Alpha Flight to Oscar Flight, giving erratic indications to the launch sites as it went. Robert Hastings did a phone interview with Captain David Schur, who actually received a launch indicator at his command post.
And as soon as you get that, of course, you gotta hit what they call an inhibit switch that stops it.
Now, what does that mean that actually a launch sequence has been triggered?
That means that the missile has received a launch signal.
I'll be darned.
David Schur flipped his inhibit switch, which only paused the launch countdown. He still had to wait for a second inhibit switch to completely stop the sequence.
If just the one comes in, it sits there for a certain amount of time, and then it'll launch automatically at the end of that expired time.
So if that second one didn't come in, then that one missile would launch?
Theoretically.
Had that ever happened before or after during your experience?
No.
Never.
You know, he's horrified, of course. He and the other officer down in the capsule, they're freaking out. You know, this could be World War III if these missiles get off the ground. Had to very quickly shut down, flipping this inhibit switch. Are these entities and the UFOs, are they trying to start World War III? And my response is no. In my opinion, what they're attempting to do is to scare the hell out of the missile forces, to show that they have the ability to interfere with the systems, that they can activate the missiles.
We as a crew were never to speak about this again. And we were told that essentially it never happened. Those were the words that were used.
During the same time period, similar incidents were occurring at Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota. Ellsworth, like many missile sites, has an outer zone and an inner zone. An outer zone alert can happen frequently, a cow rubbing against the fence, a flock of birds, but an inner zone alert, or an IZ alert, is very serious because it means something is directly above the missile capsule.
I was on duty at Echo, which is our squadron command post, and we had an OZ and an IZ call it. The strike crew is upstairs, 3 to 5 miles away, and they jumped in their trucks and went roaring out there and called me back and said, sir, for lack of a better description, there's a flying saucer hovering over that missile, and there's a beam of reddish light going down to it. Over the next few weeks, suddenly we had an influx of black Huey helicopters, completely unmarked. I walked up to one of them, there wasn't, they had to have a file somewhere written on there, but you couldn't find a tail number. And these crews in dark clothes, young, sharp men, obviously ex-military, I would guess NSA, I don't know, I never knew. But then they left, and when everything slowed down, they disappeared, and we never got any feedback from the results. To this day, I'd love to know what they captured during that time, because they were constant. This went on constantly at this time for about 3 months.
These sightings weren't limited to nuclear bases in the United States. Take the Bentwaters Rendlesham Forest incident in England.
That was the largest group of tactical nuclear weapons being stored in Western Europe.
And they were really cagey about that for a long time after the case.
The official policy to this day, is my understanding, is that the Air Force will neither confirm or deny the exact location of stored nuclear weapons.
Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt detailed the entire incident in a memo to the UK Ministry of Defence. He said that a security patrol saw strange lights descending into the nearby Rendlesham Forest. A group of servicemen entered the forest to investigate. One of the witnesses was a U.S. Air Force sergeant named Jim Peniston.
Not only do you have multiple witnesses, but you also have one of the witnesses claiming to have been taken on board a craft and speaking to these alien beings.
You're talking about Burroughs and Peniston, these two security policemen who saw this triangular-shaped craft in the woods.
Peniston says he approached a triangular, black, metallic craft that was approximately the size of a pickup truck and was emitting bright lights and a strange energy. He stated that he touched the surface of the craft, noting smooth, glass-like material and unusual symbols etched on its side that resembled hieroglyphs. According to Peniston, he experienced a profound telepathic download of binary code after touching the craft. He then transcribed this binary code into a notebook, which was reportedly decoded years later to reveal cryptic messages.
Origin year 8100.
I have not focused on that. Everyone knows the case. They've given multiple interviews and so on. But what I did from the outset was I knew that what's called a WSA, a weapons storage area, was at the Bentwaters, RAF Bentwaters base, and that there were reports that surfaced of one of the objects, aerial objects, hovering above the WSA and sending beams of light down into it. Now, Colonel Halt, when I interviewed him back in 2005, said he was out in the woods with this team. Everybody probably, a lot of people have seen these accounts where he's in the woods, he's got his tape recorder, they see this object that looks like an eyeball moving through the woods, and then they see objects in the sky, one of which hovers over he and his team of security policemen, and it fires down a beam of light at their feet, and they jump back and they go, are we being attacked? Is this a warning? What's going on here? Well, he was several miles, he said a couple of miles from the weapons storage area, but he heard on the radio that he had that security policeman back at the weapons storage area were reporting an object hovering above the weapons storage area, sending down beams of light. I tried to find and interview one of the security policemen who actually saw the beams coming down. I was unsuccessful in that regard. What I did succeed in getting were a couple of guys on the record saying that there was an object that was a multicolored disc quite near them, quite large, and one of them said that when it was brought to his attention, he turned around, he saw something that looked like a rod or an antenna from the bottom of the craft retracting into the craft, and what I surmise is that antenna or rod probably released the beam when his back was turned, and by the time he had returned, the beam was gone, and the rod was retracting into the craft. What I did independently succeed in doing was interviewing a retired colonel who was involved with NATO weapons security. He has not given me permission to use his name, but I know his background, his credentials. And what he said was when he was with NATO weapons security, he was aware that shortly after this incident, 2 tactical nuclear bombs were removed from a bunker at Bentwaters, flown aboard a C-5A aircraft to Kirtland Air Force Base, where there's a weapons lab, Air Force weapons lab, and that those weapons were analyzed, presumably to see whether any the beams had impacted them in any manner, compromised their functionality or whatever, I'm presuming.
I've never had a feeling of it being extraterrestrial.
It's always been that they were simply us in the future.
And Jim Penniston's career took sort of a hit after this too, is that right?
Jim Penniston, and I believe Burroughs too, but certainly Jim Penniston, said that he was subjected to like sodium pentothal, some kind of drug was administered to him. He was questioned.
Sodium pentothal, that's like an MK Ultra thing.
It's
a truth serum.
Commonly known as truth serum.
Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, Penniston is on record as saying he was administered something that was clearly designed to affect his mental state while he was being interrogated, so he couldn't fabricate or potentially not tell the truth, is the inference of what I've read of him saying publicly. But he said that there were British intelligence and Air Force intelligence in the room when this was being conducted on him.
One of the other witnesses, John Burroughs, a U.S. Air Force airman, also experienced physical and psychological effects.
And Burroughs had some lingering effects around his brain, possibly the dorsal striatum, the caudate and putamen of his brain. Is that right? There was some scarring there?
And his heart. I mean, he's had heart issues, so I don't know the details, but yeah, he had physical effects, certainly.
Basically, that would be a result of high electromagnetic radiation.
Conceivably, yes.
Then there's a very alarming account in 1982 in the Soviet Ukraine.
George Knapp, a well-known journalist who has broken many UFO-related stories over the years. I believe in 1994 he went to Russia, which would have been about 3 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, which was December of 1991. And he interviewed scores of former Soviet military personnel about UFO activity during the Soviet era. One of the people that I interviewed was a retired Soviet Army colonel named Vladimir Plantanov, who actually unbelievably provided Knapp with a series of still classified Soviet documents about UFO activity, and actually allowed George to take them with him in his suitcase, in essence, smuggle them back to the United States, still classified documents. And one of them described an incident in Soviet Ukraine where a huge disc-shaped object, a very large object, was seen hovering over this missile base in Soviet Ukraine. And down in one of the launch capsules, suddenly the missiles went into countdown mode. And apparently, according to this document that George Knapp brought to the West, for 15 seconds, these missiles were preparing to launch, which, had they indeed been launched, it could have been World War III.
You'll recall in the Minot case, the missiles had to be deactivated manually by their human operators. But here, they were mysteriously deactivated without any human intervention. So was this just a display of technological superiority, or was it an experiment to observe how humans respond to such scenarios? Okay, but these are all historical cases. Is any of this going on today?
I'm aware of cases that have occurred at missile sites as recently as 2015.
Less than an hour, about an hour on Saturday, the base lost primary communication with about 50 intercontinental ballistic missiles.
In 2010, at FE Warren Base in Wyoming, key personnel reported multiple independent UFO sightings that coincided with a power failure.
These 5 missile alert facilities could not communicate with the base and vice versa. If war had been declared, they would have not gotten their orders to launch their missiles. Big deal.
John Mills, a retired missile targeting technician who still had many contacts at the base, provided Robert Hastings with multiple sources who all described the craft as gray and cigar-shaped.
The description I got was the thing was as large as, maybe an aircraft carrier.
Wow.
It was cigar-shaped, it was tic-tac shaped, but it was not one of these small objects. It was like, quote, a mothership or something.
That's massive. Yeah, you talk about that in the book, is perhaps, and this is you theorizing, There's a mothership that's kind of can be large and cigar-shaped, and then saucers coming out of the mothership and coming back into the mothership.
That's been described all over the world, and I cite a handful of cases in my book where people are seeing this huge cigar-shaped object, and out of one end or the other, small disc-shaped craft come out and fly in all directions.
The Air Force tried to downplay the incident, blaming it on a faulty circuit card. In fact, they claimed they only lost communication for a mere 59 minutes. But Robert Hastings, being Robert Hastings, did some back-channeling. According to John Mills, the blackout actually persisted for over 26 hours. And in October of 2010, The Atlantic wrote a pretty telling article. It says, and I quote, "President Obama was briefed this morning on a power failure at FE Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming that took 50 nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles, 1/9 of the US missile stockpile, temporarily offline on Saturday." But here's where things get interesting. As of the making of this video, power in power failure is crossed out and replaced by the word engineering. I think The Atlantic may have made a mistake here in showing the live tracking of this edit. You can see it in this screenshot right here. Okay, so at the very least, we know that these missiles were rendered inoperable, and it represented a large enough national security issue to brief the president.
And you told me some of these witnesses had trouble in their careers. After this, they experienced some reprisals.
Presumably, someone was monitoring communications between me and John, and or he and the two technicians. Anyway, someone was aware that they had been talking about these missile disruptions and a UFO presence. And when these two individuals, they coincidentally retired around the same time in the spring of 2011, they were told on each occasion during their exit interview from the Air Force that a flag was being put in their folders citing them as a security risk, so that if they sought employment with like an aerospace company or something in the future, they would, if someone checked their Air Force file, the Air Force would have designated them to be security risks.
Another incident occurred at the Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, Area 2 weapons storage area. More recently, civilian sighting reports in Orange County, California, at the Seal Beach Naval Weapons Station, a series of bunkers, again, containing nuclear weapons. There were local media reports of multiple sightings in March of '09 near this weapons storage facility. This is ongoing. This is the tip of the iceberg. We can only catch as catch can. I am of the opinion that for every incident that I'm aware of, and for witnesses that we've got in hand, there could be 10, there could be 100, there could be many, many more incidents that I'll never know about because the people won't come forward. They'll wait years or decades to talk about what they know.
Brother, there's reports right now online. Anybody can see them. The government released a bunch of UFO-related documents not too long ago, a few years ago, thinking nobody would pay attention. I think like 10,000 reports.
Yeah.
And when you look in there, you see actual verbatim UFO incidents back in the 50s and 60s over the Savannah River facility. Over what? Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And by the way, it's still happening today.
What the fuck is that, bro?
See how it goes?
You're telling me we don't know what the hell these drones are in New Jersey are? Is that correct? That's right. It's crazy.
Recently, there have been a flurry of new sightings that confirm the UFO nuclear connection is ongoing. Strange objects have been hovering near bases in the UK and sensitive military sites in New Jersey.
Just a couple of months earlier, there were several mystery drone flights over our nuclear testing range in Nevada, just north of Las Vegas. And again, nothing was done.
And where else are UFOs showing up right now?
I've just received information in the last few minutes about the PSEG nuclear site at Salem, which is the Hope Creek Generating Station on a 740-acre site in Salem County, New Jersey. And a person who is privileged enough to have access to the internal messaging about that nuclear station has told me that they tried to deploy an anti-drone technology over multiple drones that were seen over the nuclear site, and that anti-drone technology, which normally works on all drones, completely failed.
Outside of New Jersey, where else have these UFOs shown up? None other than the epicenter of all UFO reverse engineering rumors since Roswell, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Med Flight 8 Patterson Tower, use extreme caution for heavy UAS movement on the base. Security forces is handling the situation.
What else when it comes to today's sightings rhymes with the past? Chris Mellon, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence under both Clinton and Bush, discusses a fascinating case on his blog. UFO researcher Brad Sparks thoroughly documented a UFO heading towards Eisenhower's summer home in 1957 that was noted and documented secretly, both by NORAD and Project Blue Book at the time. This prompted an immediate presidential brief, including both Eisenhower and all of the directors of the U.S. intelligence community that Monday morning, September 23rd. As officially documented by NORAD, the UFOs were tracked on multiple radars simultaneously. They varied in speed from 800 miles per hour to 12,000 miles per hour, with peak velocity occurring at 19,000 miles per hour. They varied in altitude from 50,000 to 135,000 feet, which remains unattainable by aerospace vehicles even now. And yes, they were headed directly at President Eisenhower's summer White House. And now we find out that Donald J. Trump, the next American president, had to skip his trip to his Bedminster, New Jersey summer home because of these New Jersey drones.
They happen to be over Bedminster. I think maybe I won't spend the weekend in Bedminster. I've decided to cancel my trip.
And what else does Trump say when he's asked about these exotic drones and their origins?
Our military knows where they took off from. If it's a garage, they can go right into that garage. They know where it came from and where it went. I can't imagine it's the enemy, because if it was the enemy, they'd blast it out. Even if they were late, they'd blast it. Something strange is going on. For some reason, they don't want to tell the people, and they should.
So they're strange, they're likely not the enemy, and we know where they're coming from. I would love to know the location of this garage. And check out this video filmed in November of 2024.
Bro, what is that?
There's a third one.
Oh my God. Here's the thing, these are not flashing lights. Like, there are no runway lights. These are...
Where exactly was this filmed? Right near Duke Energy's Brunswick nuclear plant in Southport, North Carolina.
I mean, look, the American people aren't stupid, you know. They're not. They may be sometimes we might be a little bit slow to realize what's going on. But, you know, in the words of Bob Marley, you can fool some people sometimes, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And that's precisely, I think, what's happening here. This administration has been caught lying about a lot of things. And look, this is not an anti-liberal or Democrat thing. This is just a dysfunctional administration.
What's going on in New Jersey right now with the so-called drones?
Yeah.
Let me tell you one. They're not drones. They aren't drones. The U.S. Air Force obfuscates everything. The U.S. Air Force says they're drones. Don't you fucking believe it? The U.S. Air Force also said that thing that I saw did not happen. The U.S. Air Force lies. They obfuscate. The Biden administration, for crying out loud, came out and said they're hallucinations. They're not hallucinations. Look, those things are not just in New Jersey. They're in Great Britain. They're in Australia. They're in the Middle East. They're all over this country.
Lakenheath, Mildenhall, Feltwell, Fairford, Ramstein Air Force Base, Wright-Patterson, Nevada National Security Site, Hill Air Force Base, Lawrence Livermore Lab, Edwards Air Force Base, and Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton.
I don't want to sound like I'm an all-knowing guru about UFOs, but those are UFOs. We are this close to nuclear annihilation right now.
Yes.
The danger has never been worse, never been more harsh, never been more believable.
So what are we seeing with these quote-unquote Jersey drones? Well, there's a great general model for critical thinking proposed by Thomas Bayes, an 18th century British statistician and philosopher. It says that when you're looking at new data, you should use prior data to analyze it. If somebody lies to you about important information 4 times and you catch them in those lies, the 5th time they say something to you, you should maybe doubt the veracity of what they're saying. So if you don't have the data from Robert Hastings' work, your analysis of what's happening today in New Jersey and all around the world is going to be wildly off. You're going to be subject to psychological manipulation by the media, Pentagon, and pretty much anyone trying to explain these sightings away as mass hysteria, hobbyist drones, or covert gamma ray detectors looking for nuclear material on the eastern seaboard. All of these lies seem more likely as possibilities for truth if you don't have any prior data. But if you do know that DC was overrun by UFOs in 1952, if you know about Lincoln LaPaz's work, if you know about Bob Jacobs' sighting at Vandenberg in '64, if you know about what Robert Salas experienced in 1967, if you know about the FE Warren case as late as 2010, then all of this might seem more likely to be a simple UFO flap, the likes of which we've been seeing for the last 75 years with the exact same characteristics as what we're seeing today.
The nuclear connection is long-standing, widespread, and ongoing.
What did it feel like when he was looking at you?
I felt scared. I felt scared because I've never seen such a person like that before.
In 1994, 62 elementary school kids at the Ariel School in Zimbabwe said that they saw a silver craft descend from the sky and land on a field near the school. Well, guess where the Ariel School was?
And you know, an Ariel School that was near a uranium mining site.
That is right,
There
as
you
far as
go.
I understand.
Yeah.
And what about that story that Vice ran in 2022 about a little town in Japan that's obsessed with UFOs? It's a place called Ino, and it's actually right next to Fukushima's nuclear grid, which has been up and running since the 70s. Because the town has been such a UFO hotspot, they even built a museum dedicated to UFOs in the 90s. And after an earthquake famously triggered a nuclear power meltdown there in 2011, the chief monk of a local temple said, "The UFOs came after the explosion. There were so many of them. I was shocked. Radioactive energy was leaking everywhere. I believe the UFOs came to readjust the flood of radioactive energy in order to save us." Similarly, Harvard PhD Jensine Andreessen writes about UFO activity at the height of the Chernobyl disaster, when many people in the area observed a UFO come, stay for 3 minutes, shine a light at the reactor, and depart. I could go on all day. In 1973, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker claimed that they were abducted and examined before being released by aliens while fishing near Pascagoula, Mississippi.
Once inside the craft, Hickson remembers being examined by an oblong-shaped instrument that hovered around him. He was completely paralyzed. Only his eyes could move.
This came to be known as the famous Pascagoula abduction. Well, people rarely point out that Pascagoula is a strategic nuclear site. In fact, it's where most of the American nuclear subs were built at the time. Even take the famous 2004 Nimitz sighting, where a Tic Tac was detected by the USS Princeton. Aircraft carriers like the USS Princeton are notoriously nuclear powered, and they might have some relevant precious cargo on board.
Even the Nimitz sighting of 2004, Lue Elizondo, I think he's sort of bound by his, obligations and clearance and stuff. And so he has to say, I think Nimitz might be nuclear powered. Right. And then he's now gone as far as saying, and it might carry some tactical nukes on board, or nukes on board, or whatever.
Right. Okay, you get it. UFOs show up at nuclear sites. But beyond sporadic interference with our signals, how do we know they're occupied by any sort of sentient beings? How do we even know these things are real physical aircrafts that land?
They were just multi-levels with all these small grays everywhere. And I was following one, and even the floor and the boards around the bottom of the floor had energy. Everything emanated power.
I sat down with Mario Woods, a former U.S. Air Force security responder. In 1977, he was stationed at Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota. Then, age 23, he experienced an incident that would change him forever, literally leaving him with missing time, marks on his body, and a colleague locked in catatonic shock for hours.
Okay, so you're in Ellsworth Air Force Base. It's 1977. You have a partner that you're working with?
Yeah,
Is that
his
right?
name, Michael Johnson. He's a real light-skinned black guy. He told me he was from Chicago, Illinois. And we only worked together that one day. He was working vacation relief for my partner, whose name was Steve Welchel. I guess it was about 9 o'clock, 9:15 or so. And I just walked outside, and you're talking prairie land as far as you can see north and east and west, and you don't see south because the building's behind you. And I see this light off to my east. It looks like a mini moon. I honestly thought it was the landing lights or some type of landing lights for B-52 bombers, because the main base supported aircraft of B-52s.
Long story short, an hour later, he and his partner, two-man security alert team partner, are called. Suddenly there's an alert because some kind of intrusion at one of the missile sites is going on. And they didn't know what that was all about. Well, he and his partner drove to that site.
And as we turned left, there sat this object on top of November 5 that was about 10 feet in the air, directly on top of that blast door, that was the size of a Walmart building.
They're freaking out. They didn't even get to radio to base to tell them what they saw. And all of a sudden, according to Mario, he and his partner, suddenly it was like all the air in the crew cab was sucked out and they were suffocating. They both suddenly started, gasping for air.
Literally could not get a breath of air. Now, I don't know if that was from my excitement. I don't know if it was from adrenaline. I'm 23 years old. I was in excellent shape. I feel something on my right side. And I turn my head and I see these 4, I'm going to call them beings. And they are not walking as you and I walk. They are just gliding across the ground, maybe, I don't know how high off the ground. I couldn't really see that. But they have these little uniforms on. And the one on the far right, he had some type of a small wand in his waist belt. I've got a drawing of it that had a yellow tip on it, some type of a yellow tip. But the one behind him was a chest and a head taller than the little guys. And he had this thing on his chest right here that pulsated the same color as what was on that little wand. And when I saw him, then I was afraid. Then I felt fear. And then I went black. I just went, that's the last thing that I saw in my mind.
And then the next thing he knew, and it seemed like the next minute, he was somewhere that he didn't really recognize, and somebody from base was calling on the radio saying, "Where are you? Where are you?" What turned out to be the case was he, his partner, and the truck had been transported roughly 5 miles to a reservoir near a little town of Newell, South Dakota.
Maybe 20 minutes passed. So this backup alert team came. And I said, I don't know where I am. I don't know where we are. So I kept trying to communicate with Michael Johnson. He wouldn't answer me in any way. He was just frozen in this position, looking straight ahead. I even tried pulling his hand off that steering wheel, and he was just, I don't know how a person can stay that tense and for so long that they don't cramp up. I would cramp up doing that, but he did.
Even though it was terribly cold at night, I mean, just ice cold, frigid, he stepped out on the ground and sunk in wet mud. So somehow the mud had been heated up right around the truck, and he was standing, like ankle deep in wet mud on a sub-zero winter night.
Did Michael Johnson ever make it out of his catatonic state, your partner?
No, not while we were there. When Sergeant Garza pulled up, he pulled up within, say, 60 feet. I said, "Hey, Sergeant Garza, how's it going?" I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Mario, I can't talk to you about this." He said, "I'm just here to escort you back to November Control."
So they lead him back to base. He's debriefed basically by, I think, the squadron commander and someone who turned out to be an OSI agent. He's taken to the base hospital and examined. He finds, I think it was on his forehead and his ankle, there was a circular wound or depression of some kind with a little dimple in the center.
Do you still have the marks at all?
Yeah.
Can I see them?
Sure. Had these socks on, squeezing the blood out.
Wow,
if you can see it.
Wow. Yeah, those look, I mean, just like perfectly vertically aligned, but like so clearly not like a spider, but like way too big for that.
Yeah.
Like, you know.
Yeah. They just kept asking questions, and I got to the point where it was just, everything was just at one time coming from every space in my mind, questions about the whole deal. And I said, hey, I got to go to the restroom. And I just went and sat on the toilet. And all of a sudden, Jesse, I get this ringing in my ears that was as if somebody struck a Liberty Bell right next to my head. I mean, really, I have to emphasize that because it was like, it got my attention. But when it happened, everything turned like lime green to me, like pea green. I closed my eyes, and when I did, I had this feeling I was leaving my body. Literally, I thought I was dying. I said, I guess this is how you die. So they left or were leaving, and I opened up the stall door, and I just went to the sink. And mind you, I still have on my long johns and my fatigue pants and shirt, and just drowning myself with water. I was just soaking wet. Because Master Sergeant Gray said something to me as I came out there. He said, what'd you do, climb in the sink or something like that? And I did. I don't even know if I answered. I just said, yes, sir. So I grabbed my stuff, and immediately I said, well, what about Michael Johnson? He said, don't worry about him. He'll be going with Sergeant Hawkins. I said, okay. And I really wanted to talk to him, but immediately upon arrival at that site, we were separated right then and there. Now, I don't know what good it would have done because he wasn't coherent or wasn't answering anything anyway.
So he hadn't said a word.
Nothing. Not one word that I knew of. Not one word. He hadn't said anything to me or to anybody else that was there. Every time I asked about Michael Johnson, they kept telling me, don't worry about Michael Johnson. He's fine. He's fine. It really bothered me.
Yeah.
It
almost sounds like they're covering for something.
Yeah, don't worry about Michael Johnson, he is fine. Off we went to Ellsworth, and it was about an hour, 10-minute ride back to Ellsworth. Went to Ralph E. Spraker's office under escort, and I remember him saying, sounds as if you've had an interesting evening or night or something like that. And I said, yes, sir. And I looked to my left, and there's a total of 5 people in that room. There's the deputy base commander, who I don't remember his name, but next to him was a man in a gray tweed suit with a hat, and the hat was under his arm. Then there was a Captain Jack Reed, OSI. Next to him was this new OSI guy named Rick Doty.
Interesting.
Yeah, because the first time I saw him was on Ancient Aliens, and I said, I know that guy. He was at my debrief.
I was a counterintelligence officer for the Air Force Office of Special Investigation.
I was personally fascinated by the fact that Richard Doty had been involved in the aftermath of Mario's case. I knew about Doty because of a great book called Project Beta by Greg Bishop. Doty was an Air Force counterintelligence agent, basically tasked with performing a psychological operation on an innocent researcher named Paul Benowitz, who had seen an exotic craft at Kirtland Air Force Base. Doty convinced Benowitz that he was in touch with aliens, even receiving signals on his computer. This eventually drove Benowitz into psychiatric hospitalization. So the fact that Doty was part of Mario's debrief is fascinating, seems very important, and requires follow-up by some brave souls.
And up to that point, I had nobody.
Yeah.
I'd had nobody that could say, yeah, they were there or whatever, what have you. I tried running down my old flight chief and assistant flight chief, but with no success or anybody else. And especially Michael Johnson. Some money has been spent trying to locate Michael Johnson. We've looked in hospitals, we've looked in...
Can't find him anywhere.
No, sir. And wow. I reported at the AARO in March of 23, I think, when I spoke with them.
Did AARO follow up at all?
I don't know. They never got back with me. And 4 hours and 19 minutes, I spoke with them.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and they said I would get a copy of everything which had been, talked about.
Can you contact Michael Johnson's family?
I don't have any way. I don't have any numbers or anything. He said he was from Chicago, Illinois. Believe me, every resource, including other law enforcement officers that I know, today's technology, have not located him yet. Neither has AARO.
So what was your interaction with Doty?
You mean in the email?
Initially, no. When you first meet him, he's in
That
this room
day?
full of 5 people. Yeah.
Nothing. Not one thing. We'd ever spoke or anything like that. He was directly reporting to Captain Jack Reed next to him.
So that's fascinating, right? That this guy, who's clearly this disinfo agent, you know, at least in the context of Benoit, and
he
don't
was
know
brand
why
new. He was brand new then. So as a person that's very high in this whole thing said, those were the days that when he was probably, honestly, not changed in any way, perhaps. I just want to say that the right way, because I email him once in a while, and he'll answer me back. Whereas it took me about 5 years to get him to even do that, and then we got to be on a cast together.
So real quick, just context. He now has come out saying he's reformed and he apologizes for, you know, his malpractice in the past. A lot of people are suspicious of that reform. It does feel a little bit sometimes to me like he's flooding the zone with this info. Like he'll talk about, you know, 6 alien races.
This crystal rectangle came from an actual alien craft.
And it just seems extremely speculative and not based on any sort of evidence.
Correct.
It's very weird.
Yeah, it's more than I know how to swallow. I only know that what I witnessed is my incident.
So how many were there? 4. Okay.
A gentleman named Jared Tarbell, who is my benefactor, he supported my research. He paid to have Mario regress a regression hypnosis session. In the video of the session where Mario is being regressed back to that night, he becomes utterly terrified. I've never seen anybody reliving an abduction experience.
He had a very long head. And he was down.
They look like grays. They look like the small grays, but the one behind them, I guess you would classify him as a tall gray. On Whitley Strieber's book, Communion, of course, the first time I saw that picture, I froze in my stride, and I had to have that book. And at Barnes and Noble or wherever it was at the time when it came out, and I literally, before I opened the first page, I literally just sat and stared at that picture for many hours before I ever even read his book.
What was the craft like? So you're in the inside of this thing. What did it look like?
A beehive.
Beehive?
Yeah.
How so?
Well, there were, from my looking around as I did in that playground, like I always try to take a mental picture of something, there were just multi-levels with all these small grays everywhere, going to and fro and doing whatever they were doing. I just got to look for a moment, and I was following one, and even the floor and the boards around the bottom of the floor had energy. Was everything emanated power in some way. The walls.
Was there a humming associated?
Not that I can remember.
And it almost felt like the tall gray was maybe in charge of these smaller grays?
Absolutely, in that room. Another thing, too, I was not on a table. I was, from my memory, I was on some type of I was like wrapped in a triangular kind of beam or something that was body length, about 4 foot in the air, and as like a strange light would, not a strange light. It's even hard to describe, but it was as if I was inserted in something that was some type of a force field or some kind of a holding field that they could move you around in. Like a gurney without wheels, a table without a back or wheels or legs attached to it. And I felt as if, when they reached in, or when he lifted my arm up, lifted me up right here on my wrist, it exited that pyramidal field or whatever it was above me, and it was in his atmosphere at that time.
If you had kind of a best guess, do you think they had positive intentions or negative, or
I think they had positive.
What do you
but
think?
They fulfill their mission, whatever that mission is, whether it's to obtain DNA material or what have you, or some kind of a programming or I don't know, whatever they want to do, they're going to do.
Outside of like the obvious, which is you experienced this kind of crazy paranormal disruption in your life, was this an inflection point, or did it change your life in a dramatic way afterwards?
Oh, it did.
How so?
I had to find out everything about archaeology and pyramids.
And so that was just something that it almost felt like it was installed inside of you or downloaded.
Yes.
And why?
Still today.
Why do you think you became so interested in that?
I have no idea.
If I was a betting man, some of this NHI, they're similarly as advanced as us, but they've asymmetric evolution or whatever. They went a different path where we made nuclear weapons and stuff. They ended up making this like civil propulsion kind of equivalent discovery where they're able to do this now, but they're actually not that much more advanced than you and I.
It just makes you wonder how much technology that has been buried somehow or another, has been removed from our everyday conscious thought. I do think that this technology that we're speaking of, even though we don't know it truly exists, it points to its existence in some way. And one day I think we will find the magic key. Somewhere there's a craft, if it hasn't already been discovered, that's sitting in a cave somewhere or under the ocean somewhere, under a ledge somewhere, or maybe even circling the planet, invisible, that we can't see we're going to run into one day. I don't know.
So there's clearly, obviously, at this point in the interview, well-demonstrated pattern between UFOs and nuclear weapons. And this brings up a really interesting kind of weird analog to all of this, which is that, Gary Nolan, Stanford microbiologist, has said that historically legacy UFO programs have used nuclear material or sometimes even phony nuclear material to bait UFOs to show up. And I believe we even have documentation that the Russians did this in the 90s as well. Do you have anything to say about that?
I'm aware that a former or retired Soviet Army colonel has said, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he's on video on the internet saying that at some point during the Soviet era, he was part of a military exercise that was intentionally designed to try to attract UFOs. And what they began doing was doing military exercises like maneuvers with no nuclear components, just conventional armaments and so on. And then they waited to see what would happen, and there were no UFO sightings. As soon as they brought nuclear battlefield nukes to the equation and they were out in the field with the other armaments, suddenly UFO sightings began. And so in this colonel's estimate, they succeeded in attracting whoever was flying the UFOs by merely introducing the presence of nuclear weapons to the situation.
Are you familiar with the Chinese science fiction novel, The Three-Body Problem?
No.
Well, in it, basically the non-human intelligence or aliens or whatever have a special interest in scientists working on the most frontier technology. And they view that technology as most deadly or likely to end the world. And so in some cases, they actually intentionally kind of stagnate the physics or send scientists in the wrong direction, or sort of use confusion tactics to actually get them to stall their progress. And I've actually heard in a couple of instances that the aliens might be interested in other sort of frontier tech, like proximity fuses, other sorts of things like that. Do you think that maybe we are being prompted on the one hand scientifically for certain, past creations, and then maybe there needs to be kind of in-step, progress made with our consciousness, and if that's not made, the NHI actually have to step in and kind of stop things. And the nuclear thing is this big juncture where you have this big asymmetric leap on the tech front, you don't have the asymmetric consciousness leap, and so that's why it's so consistent with nukes in particular.
My personal opinion is that we have had probably ongoing contact with whoever these entities are for thousands of years. I think it's conceivable they've interjected themselves into our culture and maybe even our biology. I'm not aware of any, definitive evidence, but I wouldn't be surprised if they had periodically interjected themselves into our evolution to upgrade the species, so to speak. Can't prove that, of course. I don't think anyone can, but I think it's an interesting hypothesis. The link between an increase in sightings and the advent of the nuclear age is thoroughly documented. The people on the inside, like Lue, who are now coming forward and talking, Lue Elizondo, confirmed that, what my witnesses have told me over the years, is a central part of the equation, the nuclear link with UFO activity. So in answer to your question, I don't know. I don't have any way of evaluating what specifically has been done, whether they prompted us in some ways and held us back in other ways, I don't know.
We are not here to evangelize any single theory. That's up for you to decide. We're just going to lay some of these theories out for you. Number 1, the benevolent protector theory. These UFOs are here because they don't want us to destroy ourselves. By tampering with our nukes, they want to show us that we're playing with fire.
Join us and live in peace, or pursue your present course and face obliteration.
It's kind of like taking matches out of the hands of a baby. Whoa. Yeah, whoa, right?
If they are out there and they are disabling our nukes, they're not doing it because they're a threat to us. They're doing it because we're a threat to ourselves, and maybe we're a threat to some aspects of the universe.
Number 2, parasitic host theory. Maybe UFOs are in fact deterring us from nuclear war, but because they're just protecting their resources. They're mining us for something and don't care about us at all. By the way, this is not mutually exclusive with benevolent protector theory, especially if there are factions of non-human intelligence.
If they have projects here, if they have bases here, they have bases here. A worldwide nuclear catastrophe is going to drastically impact what they've got going on, in addition to what we as humans in our civilization have at risk. And therefore, it doesn't have to necessarily be just altruistic. It could be a self-serving motivation as well.
Number 3, UFOs are somehow affected by the electromagnetic fallout from nuclear tests. Gamma radiation following atomic blasts messes with the flight path of UFOs and pops them into our reality. This is a very interesting theory and still very possible, but it wouldn't fully explain why UFOs show up around atomic assets when there are no nuclear blasts. Again, this theory is not mutually exclusive with option 1 or 2. Number 4, simulation theory. Humans are in a low-level, time-bound dimension that these UFOs have transcended. The UFOs want to monitor our ability to break out of our simulation. One of the ways to break out would be through high-energy nuclear physics. Right now, our biggest nukes emit 80 to 100 megatons of TNT. If we get upwards of 1 × 10⁹ tons of TNT, we might be able to start ripping little holes in space-time. So aliens might be monitoring the axis of human progress in energy output as we inch out of our 3D time-bound cave.
I think the Tsar bomb is something like 10 to the 6th tons of TNT or something.
The largest nuclear detonation, yeah.
And I think once you get to 10 to the 9th and up, you start to rip little holes in space-time or something like that. And so, is there something around nuclear that somehow speaks to the fabric of space-time itself and allows us to see other worlds that might exist all the time, but we just somehow don't have the aperture for it without this sort of nuclear leakage?
What I've said, and when I hear that, you have to consider that every star in the universe is nothing but nonstop nuclear detonations, on a vastly larger scale than what we humans do here on Earth. So one would think if somehow our detonations are ripping holes in space-time, why wouldn't every star in the universe rip holes in space-time? But, so that's my point.
Number 5, UFOs are just secret American anti-gravity exotic propulsion co-located on nuclear bases. As somebody who's gone decently deep on gravity research mid-century, I would actually entertain this, but it just doesn't account for what happened to Mario Woods and Jim Penniston at Rendlesham. This also wouldn't explain UFO sightings around nuclear bases that occur as early as the 40s. I just don't believe that man-made exotic propulsion technology was that good at the time. Number 6. And maybe my favorite theory. I think this is as entertaining as it is maybe unlikely. But there are apparently folks in the American national security state that say that the German Netflix show Dark points to bits of reality. In this theory, nuclear fuels were used mid-century to alter gravity. We know that gravity and time are linked in general relativity. So maybe with the exotic gravity research we were doing in the 50s, we were also looking into manipulating time. And that research may have been taking place on nuclear bases across the United States. I admit it's hard for me to believe that we've perfected time travel. But if we do ever perfect time travel in the future, these programs would be co-located at our most sensitive national security sites.
You know, Lawrence Bell is, so Bell Aircraft. So they broke the sound barrier in 1947.
Yeah, X-15.
X-15, Chuck Yeager, exactly. And so there's an article in 1956 where they're saying, we're going to beat gravity, and it's right around the bend. And Lawrence Bell's quote from this article is, we are already working with nuclear fuels to cancel out gravity. And so you got to think, if time travel is possible at any point in the future, it's probably always been possible, right? And so where would we discover some sort of time travel program? It would probably be co-located with nuclear programs.
Absolutely.
So, and then how would you affect timelines? You might do it with, particular people who represent kind of nodes or whatever, who get interested in things like pyramids after, their encounters. And so do you think that, that's a possible explanation, that maybe a future time travel program represents an overlay over all of these nuclear sites in a way that somehow might profoundly shift humanity and might also keep us alive? Because if you think about where is the center of the apocalypse, it's these nuclear sites. I mean, what's going to dictate the end of the world or not? It's going to be these sites.
So maybe with UFO abductions, we are experiencing remnants of a future time travel program that is co-located with our nuclear assets. Just look at what famed director Steven Spielberg had to say.
What if they're not from an advanced civilization 300 million light years from here? But what if it's us 500,000 years into the future?
In fact, the most prolific gravity-related inventor mid-century was the aforementioned Thomas Townsend Brown. But people don't know that Townsend Brown was actually obsessed with time travel. He even sort of referred to himself as a time traveler. When I asked Brown's daughter what Townsend would be up to if he is in fact a time traveler, this is what she had to say.
Oh boy, if there's something happening that's truly dangerous, probably would be the middle. In other words, if someone was trying to get ready to launch, my dad would be rearranging their figures so they wouldn't come up with what they thought that they would come up with.
Wow.
Obviously, this secret time travel theory might be imperfect, or rather incomplete. It would not, for example, explain UFOs coming out of the plume of nuclear blasts. I should also add that none of these theories really characterize the beings themselves. They could be a whole host of things: time-traveling humans, remnants of a technologically advanced civilization co-located on Earth, or your classic extraterrestrials. And not to confuse you too much, but even these options could be false dichotomies and are not always mutually exclusive.
Free your mind.
I've said this to other people. Sometimes I see us when we're being crazy and talking about nuclear war, that we might be cage 22 in a universal lab somewhere, and they come and check us every once in a while to see if we're going to kill each other, and they might be just monitoring us to keep us peaceful. No way of telling. It's been so, they've been so not physical so far. So I hope it's that, and I hope there's something good to come from this.
Now, at this point, you're probably asking, why isn't this more widely known? UFOs showing up across the most sensitive global nuclear sites. That's insane, and everyone should know about it. I agree with you. Now would probably be a good time to note that the people who have done the most damage to the UFO conversation have come from the same atomic programs that are actively investigating UFOs and trying to keep them secret.
I find it really interesting that you have some of the most prominent debunkers, guys like Menzel, guys like Condon, H.P. Robertson, who were kind of big shots, who also worked on the Manhattan Project. Condon was involved in the Manhattan
I didn't realize that.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting.
He worked with Vannevar Bush a lot.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
The Condon Committee was supposed to be an open, independent investigation of UFOs in 1966, at the tail end of Project Blue Book.
Among the project's dozen experts are Director Dr. Edward Condon, formerly physicist with the National Bureau of Standards.
The whole project was led by a quantum physicist named Edward Condon.
Air Force wanted to get out of this job. They commissioned a study from University of Colorado. Ed Condon led the studies, a Manhattan Project alum. He wrote the conclusion of the study before the study was complete, bragged about it. A lot of the scientists on the study defected publicly from the study. The study got published. The content of the study is at odds with the conclusions, but the Air Force canceled Project Blue Book anyway.
What most people don't know is that Edward Condon was a complete Manhattan Project insider. He was very close to Robert Oppenheimer, having studied under Max Born with him at Göttingen in Germany in the 1920s. In fact, Condon and Oppenheimer were so close that Condon was partly credited for picking Los Alamos as the focal point for the Manhattan Project. He knew the area well, having grown up around the corner in Alamogordo. He also recruited a lot of the project's early staff and wrote the Los Alamos Primer, which all employees had to read upon arrival.
We would welcome not only better evidence about them, but also suggestions as to better ways of investigation.
The Condon Commission was a supposedly independent UFO review panel, paid for but not influenced by the Air Force. But later, from verified letters, we learned that Condon was closely coordinating with Air Force Colonel Robert Hitler, who had expressed pretty clear written desire that all previous UFO research, including Project Blue Book, be shown as a waste of time and money. Condon successfully performed his hit job. Blue Book ended, and UFO research would become quackery for another 50 years. Now fast forward to today.
AARO is a member of the department's support to the administration's Tiger Team effort to deal with stratospheric objects such as the PRC high-altitude balloon.
AARO continues this tradition of downplaying, dismissing, or even possibly destroying UFO evidence after having some pretty interesting ties to nuclear programs.
In early 2023, January 2023, Kurt McConnell, who is a retired Senate Armed Service Committee investigator, contacted me and said, AARO wants you to get together some of the veterans who had experiences at nuclear weapons sites, and they want to interview them. Would you be willing to do that? So long story short, I think it was 11 people, veterans I had interviewed over the years, went and spoke with AARO. And so at some point, this would have been March of 2023, Kurt McConnell sent me an email saying, I drove Lue down to his interview with AARO. On the way back from his interview, Lue told me that he told Kirkpatrick that he had seen the Big Sur film, the shoot down of a dummy nuclear warhead by a UFO that Dr. Bob Jacobs has talked about for decades and decades. Lue told Kirkpatrick where he had seen the film. It was in a safe drawer, I was told. And Kirkpatrick allegedly went and looked at tried to find it and claimed it was not there.
He's now left AARO, but he is part of the supposed official UFO review program. And so we're now saying that actually UFO programs were probably really bound up with American atomic programs since kind of 1940s, 1950s. And you look at Sean Kirkpatrick's track record and his resume, when he was 17 years old, he was given a grant by the Department of Energy because of, impressing them at Brookhaven Lab. Or I think he went to Brookhaven Labs as a result of this grant or something. He worked at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, a clear atomic site, one of the oldest ones in Tennessee. If you look at some of his ResearchGate papers, they're very interesting when it comes to the UFO phenomenon. That's all I'll say. I think viewers should go, look up, some of this stuff.
Wow.
His company was released, I believe, and it was called Nonlinear, LLC, something like that. Nonlinear algebra is one of the things that, you need when studying gravity and some of this kind of weirder stuff. And then finally, the only thing he consistently says is, we have no evidence of extraterrestrials. He always says that, extraterrestrial. Extraterrestrial is an extrapolation. That is a conclusion that you've come to, that this thing is definitely from Zeta Reticuli or Proxima Centauri or some other planet.
Right.
So it's very easy to say that and act like you're not lying, when of course we don't have evidence. There are probably theorists still working on where these things are from. Are they from other planets? Are they from different dimensions and time? Who knows?
Right.
But it's very easy for him to do that, and he just rests on that over and over again. So
when I wrote to the veterans, I'm still in touch with roughly 20 people that I interviewed years ago, and I still have contact information for them. So I wrote to all those guys. I think it was 11 of roughly 20 who agreed to speak with AARO. In the email that I sent to these guys, I said, my opinion is that AARO is a front. It's the Condon Committee 2.0. In my opinion, Kirkpatrick is a shill for somebody, possibly CIA, DIA, NSA, whoever. I said, you can, talk your heart out and describe what happened to you in the missile field, but they're not going to take it seriously. But I might be wrong, and on the off chance that miracles sometimes happen, maybe your testimony will have some impact, and therefore I urge you to go and speak to AARO. Well, they did, and I subsequently learned that AARO, the people that took the testimony from these veterans, did not record them. They were told, a couple of the veterans were told, well, we're taking notes. Well, if you're conducting a serious investigation, you want to tape record every word, every grunt, every syllable, and they did not record any of the interviews, according to the veterans, and they quote, took notes. And then the culmination, of course, was when Kirkpatrick addressed Senator Gillibrand's committee in April of 23 and said, we had point blank, blanket statement, we were presented with no evidence that these were extraterrestrial craft. And all the veterans immediately, over the course of a few days, wrote to me and said, they betrayed us, AARO betrayed us, Kirkpatrick betrayed us. We stuck our necks out and talked about UFOs shutting down our nuclear missiles in the 60s and 70s before, decades before we or the Russians or the Chinese had any technology that could have done what we saw with our own eyes. Clearly, it was something off Earth going on, and yet, we stuck our necks out, talked to AARO, and that's what this guy says to Congress.
Yeah, you have these American patriots who signed up to guard our most important national defense assets, who've been traumatized by what they've seen and just want the American public to know the basic ontological truth of what they've experienced, and which is an experience that is widespread and it's global, and it's not conferring any sort of advantage to an adversary by letting this out.
Yeah.
And you have this guy in Kirkpatrick, and this is why I think it needs to be more widely known, because I think I've heard that a lot from people on the inside, where it's like hoping on a prayer. I mean, I think AARO is worthless, but maybe I'll testify, and talk to them.
Right.
I think it's more insidious than that. I think they take your testimony and they try to destroy the evidence.
Yeah.
And so it's just absolutely horrible.
I have never from day one thought that there was any merit to AARO, and I still don't. And no matter who's in control, the fix is in. It's, it's a smokescreen. It's more of Project Blue Book, for our time frame.
And what about Brookhaven National Labs in Long Island? Have any crashes occurred there?
It's about 7 o'clock at night, and being November, it was full dark. And all of a sudden, it was lighter out than it is right now.
Brookhaven is associated with Stony Brook University, and the legendary hedge fund manager and mathematician Jim Simons. Now, just look at who ran the independent NASA review panel on UAPs in 2022. Might they have any ties to Jim Simons?
You don't have to be the conspiracy theorist drawing the red dots of the yarn to be like, here's a money-making machine started by a guy deeply connected to the NSA that's also a super physics genius, and it can attract the smartest physics and math people on the planet to work for his black box money machine. And his, guy running his private research foundation and fundamental physics gets tapped to run the UAP working group for NASA.
Yeah, a working group that sort of says, nothing to see here. We'll keep an open mind, but there's probably nothing here, which I find interesting.
It is essential to clarify, based on our current findings and methodology, that we find no evidence to suggest that UAP are extraterrestrial in origin.
I don't want to speculate on this too much, I'm just the messenger. For more information on this, you should watch this amazing interview that Eric Weinstein did on Joe Rogan. I'm linking it in the description.
If I was going to locate a Manhattan Project in plain sight and get U.S. News and World to report this as a minor player in research, that's where I'd go.
You can't let the fox watch the hen house, and if you have a agency or a group within the Defense Department or the intelligence community running the show and allegedly investigating UFO activity at nuclear weapons sites, you're going to get nowhere quick, and that's the whole idea.
Do you feel like your communications are being tracked? Or
no question.
What do you have any clear, concrete examples that will show people that you're not being paranoid?
I went out on the lecture circuit for the first time in September of '81 and spoke at, I believe, 16 schools between September and the end of the year. Okay, and in my audiences at various schools around the country, veterans would come up to me and say, I know what you're talking about. I was involved this, that, and the other. I would say, can we talk about this on the phone? When I get off the lecture circuit, I'll be home in early next year, '82. And some said yes, some said no. But I did interview a handful of veterans from home over the phone and taped the conversations with their permission. In most cases, in some cases, they didn't want them taped. But anyway, they were telling me about what they had witnessed at various missile bases through the years. And after each one of those calls, this was primarily in February of '82, I would talk to them, thank them, hang up the phone. Within a minute or 5 or 10, the phone would ring, I would pick it up, and there'd be nothing but heavy breathing in the phone.
That's creepy.
Our government does not necessarily blink, trying to turn your reputation into absolute garbage if you get close to its treasured sources and methods.
Yeah.
And that is not compatible with saying that we have something that we don't understand menacing our military, its airspace, and our nuclear sites.
I stated to you that I would not have mentioned very much of it to anybody except my fellow missileers, because I didn't want to get investigated by the Office of Special Investigations, sometimes known as OSI. And I did not want it to reflect on my officer efficiency report, the OER.
Feels like in the past 5 to 7 years, there's been a lot of vindication for your work and for people who are active in service to be confirming the things that you were telling the public in late 90s and early 2000s. How does that feel to now see it, to see Lue on Joe Rogan showing Joe the Montana documents?
I don't recall whether we discussed this yesterday, but in the New York Times article that came out in December of 2017, Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, that basically exposed ATIP to the world. In the article, they mentioned that ATIP's scientific advisor was Dr. Hal Puthoff. And I was shocked because in 2005, I reached out to him to help me write a chapter in my book on faster than light travel. I knew that he had done a peer-reviewed paper on it. So, and then in 2008, when the first edition of UFOs and Nukes came out, he suddenly wrote to me and said, I need 4 copies of the book shipped overnight. And I checked into it. It was going to be $115. And I got back to him and said, you know, what's the rush? That's a lot of money. Just let me send it media mail. And he said, Robert, day after tomorrow, I have a meeting with some movers and shakers in Washington, and I'm going to distribute your book. And what I didn't know until, this was December of '08, what I didn't know until January of 18, once the New York Times story came out, Hal had given copies of my book to the ATIP members, at least Lue, and it turns out Senator Harry Reid was given a copy. Now, just last December of '23, George Knapp interviewed me for a Netflix documentary that's coming up, and before he started asking me questions, he said, are you aware that Harry Reid had read your book and it was one of the reasons he had sought funding for OSAP? And I said, you know, really? And he said, he told me that point blank. And, you know, there were a number of reasons that he felt that there had to be a new UFO investigation, but apparently the witness testimony contained in my book was one of the reasons that he decided that had to be done sooner rather than later. So that feels good to know. Yeah. It feels good to know.
Well, that should be vindicating.
You know, I mean, I'm 74 years old, and it just seemed like decades have gone by where not much progress has been made in terms of public awareness. I mean, I've spoken at over 500 colleges and universities, so those people were in on my work. The local media who covered the program were in on my work, but the national media for decades avoided me like the plague. They, you know, I'd send press releases out. No one covered me at all. So finally, in just the last 5 years, I'm getting the sense that, hey, you know, it was worth all the time and effort that I put into it. So yeah, it feels good.
And it's interesting. We're going to get into some of the deeper roots as to how you got attracted to all the UFO stuff. But, you know, the nominal story in UFOs and Nukes, at least, is that you were a janitor and your father was stationed at Malmstrom Base in '67, and you were learning about radar theory, and you know, radar operator calls you over, you see these unknowns.
Right.
I think in many ways Hal Puthoff has a similar story where he sort of stumbled upon the UFO stuff. He ran the CIA's psychic spy program, and I think a lot of these remote viewers would see beings, you know, in various places on, you know, the dark side of the moon in Ingo Swann's case, you know, elsewhere, and Joseph McMoneagle saw bases on Earth.
Right.
And I think that got him up to speed on, okay, maybe there's some other presences out here. He then joined, this is the part of the story people don't really know, he then joined something called the Advanced Theoretical Physics Group, ATP group. And it was him and Oki Shannon, who was, you know, physics lead at Los Alamos, project lead there. John Alexander, who has a long history in this, and I think is sort of maybe tied in with the DOE or something. And they're all sort of studying, and I think Eric Davis probably joined later, and they're all studying, you know, the physics of UFOs. Like, how would this stuff actually work theoretically? And I think Puthoff figured out a lot, and I think he's much deeper than people realize on the actual science of this stuff. So
somewhere, well, I saw a video, and I think it was McGonigal.
Yes.
Was called to the Pentagon one day and was told to go to this room, and he goes in and he said it was like a broom closet, but it had a table in it. So he sat down, and if I remember the story correctly, someone came in and said, we want you to use remote viewing for this site. And the story is that he basically saw a UFO hovering over a nuclear missile, which I thought was pretty interesting. So
Joseph McMoneagle, for people that don't know, has done more televised remote viewings than anybody in the world. He was known as remote viewer #1.
Wow.
And he was, you know, the most talented and most consistent psychic spy for the Stargate program. Also, talk about this stuff running in families. He happens to be the nephew of Robert Monroe, who is doing all sorts of consciousness studies. This, you know, still has in his namesake the Monroe Center in Virginia, named after him. And McMoneagle lives in Faber, Virginia, right around there. And I remember being on the phone with Joseph McMoneagle once, and he was saying, you know, yeah, it's crazy. You know, the ET stuff is definitely real. He was giving me all this interesting evidence and talking about the remote viewing stuff. And then he said something that I will never forget. He said that I think we might be turning into these ETs or something. They might be sort of prompting us to turn into some of them.
I can't help but wonder if we're on the precipice of a massive revolution in human consciousness.
Yeah.
Where we either evolve there together or we bifurcate and still evolve there, but in a very different way.
We will have our minds expanded. There will be a paradigm shift. Traditional institutions such as religions, governments, other social institutions may indeed be threatened by what is coming. That is just a logical consequence of what is about to occur.
I want to thank the legendary Robert Hastings for his multi-decade-long, tireless dedication to telling the stories of these brave patriots who just want a broader surface on an ontological truth that is global, ubiquitous, and should not be classified. But Hastings exists in a tradition of other researchers who have called out the UFO nuclear connection before him, some of whom will not see the vindication that Hastings will see in his lifetime. James McDonald was a physicist at Arizona State who, after seeing a UFO at Savannah River Site nuclear facility in South Carolina, was made a public mockery of. Harry Turner was the head of the Australian nuclear program. He became very convinced in the UFO nuclear connection, writing candidly that he thought the Americans had gone much deeper on UFOs and anti-gravity than the fake Air Force Project Blue Book would have you believe. Turner was well acquainted with the UFO nuclear link due to many unusual occurrences in Australia's own atomic test range. Turner suggested in a 1971 document that the Australian government invest more time and effort in UFO research. The government unfortunately did not listen to him. If you read Robert Hastings' book, he's not telling you what to think. He's not saying that we're definitely living in the plot of the day the Earth stood still, that these beings are definitely trying to deter us from destroying the planet and ourselves. Although he is partial to the benevolent protector theory, a bit more than the hostile adversary theory. Hastings' main point is a scientific one, that we can't just throw out the testimony of almost 200 stand-up patriots who are screened for their mental health and say that they are seeing UFOs repeatedly showing up in sensitive American airspace. That's just bad science and bad thinking. But I will say our world is truly on the brink, and there's likely just a narrow path out. We can react to these nuclear-linked UFO sightings in one of two ways. We can clamp down, or we can reach out. Perhaps the message that a 23-year-old Mario Woods got from the beings he encountered are the most relevant here.
I kept hearing over and over, do not fear, do not fear.
What do you hope the world gets from your testimony?
Understanding, perhaps? Or possibility of, not to think that they're here to defeat us, because if they were, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now.
Can you talk to me? Can you hear me? God is good. God is good. God is good.
This story, like most, is stranger than you could ever imagine. I wish it were simpler, and I wish this were the end of it. But in our next episode with Robert Hastings, we're going to go one level deeper.
I always cite you when I speak to UFO skeptics because, as evidenced by this interview, you don't miss a name, a date, the setup of all these Air Force bases and nuclear sites. And so I cite you to skeptics who need that level of rigor. They need this repeatable thing in the form of the nuclear connection. And so I think it is incredibly courageous that you've written a second book, and it's called Confession. And it's really a revelation around what you've experienced personally around the phenomena. And it feels like you were maybe worried about putting this out very reasonably because you thought it would hurt your credibility.
Right.
You have had some of your own experiences with these entities and their crafts, is that right?
I have, and